"Happy birthday," Mr. President whisper, her real voice, scared, honest, and human, sitting on a cassette tape in a locked archive, untouched, unheard, almost forgotten. And then, decades after her death, someone finally pressed play. What came out of those speakers stopped a film crew in its tracks. People who had spent years studying Marilyn Monroe, who thought they knew every detail of her life, sat in silence because the woman on the tape did not sound like a legend. She sounded like a person who was drowning, and no one around her seemed to notice. This is the story of how that recording surfaced, why it was buried for so long, and why the moment it played out loud, it changed the way Hollywood remembers its most famous star. Nobody expected this. For over half a century, Marilyn Monroe existed almost entirely as an image, a photograph, a poster, a voice imitated by other people in movies about her life. The real sound of her thinking out loud, unscripted, unguarded, was something historians assumed was simply gone, lost the way most private moments from the 1950s and 60s are lost, buried under studio publicity and second-hand retellings. So when researchers realized that actual audio of Marilyn Monroe speaking about her own inner life still existed, sitting quietly in an archive most people had never heard of, it felt less like a discovery and more like a resurrection. And once word started spreading about what was actually on those tapes, the reaction inside Hollywood circles was not excitement. It was unease, because this was not fan fiction, and it was not a reenactment. This was her. Ask yourself this. How many times have you watched an actress play Marilyn Monroe in a movie or a miniseries, copying the walk, the voice, the laugh, and accepted it as close enough because nothing more authentic was ever going to surface? That was the unspoken assumption for 60 years. Every impersonation, every biopic, every tribute performance was built on guesswork, filtered through other people's memories of what she sounded like. The idea that her actual unscripted voice might one day surface, describing her actual unscripted thoughts, was not something most people even considered possible. It simply was not supposed to exist anymore. To understand why this recording matters, you have to go back to August 1962, the night the most photographed woman on Earth was found dead in her Brentwood home. The official story was fast, tidy, and closed within hours. Probable suicide. Barbiturate overdose, case closed. But almost immediately, people close to Monroe started whispering that the timeline did not add up. Phone records were missing. Witnesses gave different accounts of what time she died. Her psychiatrist arrived at the house before the police did. And for 20 years, nobody with real authority was willing to reopen the file. Then in 1982, something shifted. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office announced it was formally reviewing Monroe's death for the first time since the original investigation. That decision opened a door that had been sealed for 2 decades, and it caught the attention of a British investigative journalist named Anthony Summers, a man with a background covering war zones and political scandals, not Hollywood gossip. Summers was not interested in another glossy biography. He wanted to know what actually happened in the final hours of Marilyn Monroe's life, and he was willing to spend years finding out. What Summers did next is almost unheard of in celebrity journalism. Over the course of 3 years, he tracked down and interviewed roughly 650 people who had known Monroe personally, or who had direct knowledge of the circumstances surrounding her death. Studio executives, makeup artists, police officers, hairdressers, agents, family members of her doctors. He recorded every single conversation on cassette and microcassette tape, building what would become one of the largest private audio archives ever assembled about a single Hollywood star. Summers did not approach this like a fan. He approached it like an investigator building a case file. He tracked down retired police officers who had been at the scene. He found ambulance attendants who had never spoken publicly. He located people who had worked in Monroe's home, people who had answered her phones, people who had sat across from her in her final, chaotic year. Some of them had never told anyone what they knew. Some of them had waited 20 years for someone to finally ask. Here is the part almost nobody knew for decades. Those tapes were not just background research for a book. They were a time capsule, real voices recorded in real time, describing things about Marilyn Monroe that never made it into any official record. And once Summers finished his book, Goddess, in 1985, most of those recordings went quiet. They were boxed up, stored, and left largely untouched by the public for close to 40 years. Think about that for a second. Nearly 4 decades of raw, unfiltered testimony about one of the most scrutinized women in modern history, sitting in storage while the rest of the world kept repeating the same second-hand stories about her life and death. That silence is exactly why what happened next hit so hard. The The tapes eventually made their way into a serious archive, the Margaret Herrick Library, operated by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences as part of a larger Monroe research collection. And it was there that something remarkable happened. Archivists began the slow, careful process of digitizing more than 300 original cassette and microcassette recordings, transferring decades-old audio into a format the modern world could finally access. Digitizing 300 aging cassette and microcassette tapes is not a simple task. Analog tape degrades. Magnetic particles flake off with every playback. Some of these recordings were 4 decades old by the time anyone tried to preserve them properly, which means there was a real possibility that some of this material could have been lost forever if archivists had waited even a few more years. In a very real sense, this story almost never happened at all. A handful of cassette shells sitting in a box could have simply crumbled into silence before anyone got the chance to save them. Archivists working with aging magnetic tape often describe a race against time that the public never sees. Every year, a recording sits untouched in a warehouse. The odds of it playing back cleanly get worse. Tape can warp with humidity, stretch with age, or simply become too brittle to run through a machine without snapping. The fact that this particular collection survived intact enough to be transferred to digital files decades after it was recorded is, by archival standards, something close to lucky. A slightly warmer storage room, a slightly longer delay, and an entire piece of Marilyn Monroe's story could have been gone for good, with nobody ever knowing what was lost. This is where the story stops being about old paperwork and starts becoming about a voice. Because buried inside that collection were not only interviews about Marilyn Monroe, there were recordings that captured fragments of Marilyn Monroe herself, drawn from sessions she had with her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, the same man who would later be at the center of the timeline dispute surrounding her death. Dr. Greenson is one of the most controversial figures in the entire Monroe story. He was not a distant professional. By the final years of her life, he had become deeply, almost uncomfortably involved, visiting her home constantly, blurring the line between therapist and confidant in a way that modern psychiatric ethics would never allow. He was also the man who, according to the official account, discovered her body. Any recording connected to his private sessions with Monroe was never meant to see daylight, which makes its survival and its eventual surfacing even more extraordinary. Picture the moment an archivist or a documentary researcher first sat with headphones on, listening to a tape that had not been played in public for longer than most viewers of this story have been alive. The tape hisses, there's a pause, and then a voice comes through, unmistakably hers, speaking not as a performer but as a patient, talking through fear, insecurity, and the crushing weight of being turned into a symbol instead of being treated as a person. That is the moment Hollywood fell silent, not because of a scandal, not because of a conspiracy theory, because for the first time people were not hearing about Marilyn Monroe. They were hearing from her. What she talks about on these recordings is not the glamorous icons splashed across magazine covers. She describes feeling like she has no control over her own life, like every person around her, from studio bosses to lovers to so-called friends, wants a piece of the character she built, rather than the woman underneath it. She talks about loneliness in a way that is almost unbearable to listen to, precisely because the entire world assumed she had everything. She talks about not trusting the people closest to her, about feeling used by men who claim to love her, about the strange exhaustion of constantly having to be Marilyn Monroe in every single room she walked into, even when all she wanted was to disappear for an afternoon and just be a person nobody recognized. Anyone who has ever felt like they were performing a version of themselves just to be accepted will recognize something painfully familiar in that description, even if their life looks nothing like hers. There is a particular kind of chill that comes from hearing someone describe their own unraveling before the rest of the world watched it happen on the front page. Listeners who have heard portions of these sessions describe an eerie sensation, like watching a countdown you cannot stop, because you already know how the story ends and she does not. Imagine being one of the first people in the modern era to hear this. You are sitting in an editing room, headphones on, and instead of the polished movie star voice everyone expects, you hear hesitation. You hear someone thinking mid-sentence, backtracking, correcting herself. It does not sound like a performance because it was never meant to be one. It sounds like a woman trying to explain, maybe for the very first time, exactly how much she was struggling underneath the image the entire world had built around her. This is where the emotional gut punch lands hardest. Marilyn Monroe spent her entire adult life being told what to say, how to move, how to smile for cameras that never stopped watching her. And in the one place she thought was private, a a therapist's office, she was still being recorded. She never knew that her most vulnerable words would end up preserved on tape, then archived, then digitized, then eventually played for a global audience decades after her death. There is something deeply uncomfortable about that, and even the people who worked on bringing this material forward have admitted it. Emma Cooper, the director who eventually built a documentary around Summers's original interview tapes, has spoken about the strange responsibility of handling this kind of material. She has described sitting with Summers as he played sections of the tapes for the production team, and watching the room go quiet as everyone realized they were not listening to research anymore. They were listening to history speaking directly to them. Cooper has said that watching Summers cue up these recordings felt less like a research meeting and more like opening a door that had been bolted shut for a generation. There was no script for how to react. There was no press release template for hearing a dead icon speak candidly about her own despair. The crew simply sat there, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all. Now, here is where the story widens beyond just heartbreak, because these tapes do not only reveal Monroe's private pain, they reveal a web of political entanglement that reads more like a Cold War thriller than a celebrity biography. Among the 650 interviews Summers recorded, several center on Monroe's relationships with the Kennedy brothers, President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. One recording features Robert Kennedy's own secretary, describing how Monroe would place phone calls that were quietly returned by Bobby Kennedy himself. Another set of recordings ties back to a period when Monroe traveled to Mexico and associated with individuals the United States government had already flagged as communist sympathizers, people who had been expelled from the country for their political activity. That detail matters more than it might seem at first, because those associations reportedly triggered attention from federal authorities. Monroe had an FBI file, and according to Summers' reporting, that file carried the designation Security Matters, Communist, in an era defined by Cold War paranoia, a Hollywood sex symbol linked romantically to the sitting president and his brother, while also socializing with people under federal suspicion, was not just gossip. It was the kind of combination that could unsettle people at the highest levels of government. Consider what that means in practical terms. A woman who was reportedly in direct phone contact with the sitting Attorney General of the United States was, at the same time, being tracked by federal intelligence for her associations with people the government considered a security threat. That is not a minor footnote in a celebrity biography. That is the exact kind of overlap that, in any other context, would trigger congressional hearings. The only reason it did not become a bigger scandal in real time is that Marilyn Monroe died before anyone was forced to answer for it publicly. Now imagine that information sitting quietly on tape for 40 years, only surfacing in full once the recordings were finally digitized and presented to the public through Summers' book, and later through the documentary built around his archive. Suddenly, Marilyn Monroe's death stops looking like a simple tragedy and starts looking like a moment where entertainment, politics, and national security all collided at once, with a single woman caught directly in the middle of it. It's no surprise that when portions of this material reached a wider audience through Netflix's documentary, The Mystery of Marilyn Monroe, The Unheard Tapes in 2022, it did not just circulate among film historians. It became one of the most talked about entertainment stories of that year, reigniting a decades-old debate about whether Monroe's death was exactly what the official record claimed, or whether there were forces at play that had every reason to want the full story to stay buried. Reactions poured in from multiple directions. Long-time Monroe biographers who had spent careers piecing together second-hand accounts finally had something closer to a primary source, actual voices from actual witnesses, some of whom had already passed away by the time the tapes reached the public. For researchers, it was like finding a missing chapter in a story they thought was already fully written. Social media reaction, once clips and quotes from the material started circulating, was immediate and intense. People who had grown up seeing Marilyn Monroe reduced to a meme, a costume, a punchline about blonde bombshells, suddenly found themselves confronted with a very different image, a woman describing genuine fear about her own mental state, decades before that kind of honesty became normal for public figures to share. Comment sections filled with the same sentiment over and over. Nobody knew it was this bad, and nobody had really tried to find out until now. Entertainment journalists who cover classic Hollywood noted a shift in tone across the wider conversation as well. Coverage that once treated Monroe's death almost like true crime entertainment, full of speculation and dramatic reenactment, started leaning instead toward genuine reflection on how the studio era treated its most valuable stars. That shift, subtle as it may seem, represents a real change in how this story is being told. moving away from pure spectacle and towards something closer to accountability. Fans reacted with a mixture of heartbreak and anger. Heartbreak because hearing Monroe describe her own isolation in her own words made her feel less like a poster and more like a person who was failed by almost everyone around her. Anger because so many of these recordings sat unheard for so long, while books, films, and tabloids kept profiting off second-hand versions of her story instead of the real thing. Not everyone was convinced the tapes changed anything, and that skepticism is worth addressing honestly. Critics have pointed out that Summers himself, despite uncovering explosive material about the circumstances around her death, ultimately concluded that Monroe most likely died by suicide or an accidental overdose, not murder. Some historians argue that dramatic packaging around unheard tapes risks implying a bigger conspiracy than the actual evidence supports. Others note that second-hand interview recollections, even when recorded decades closer to the events than we are now, are still memories, filtered through time, grief, and personal bias. There is also a more practical objection worth mentioning. Some media critics have warned that framing 40-year-old interview tapes as a sudden breaking revelation can blur the line between genuine new evidence and repackaged old material presented with more dramatic music. That is a fair point, and it is worth holding on to as this story continues to be retold. The tapes themselves are real, the voices on them are real, but the excitement around finally hearing them says as much about how slowly institutions move to release historical material as it does about any single shocking new fact. That tension is part of what makes this story so gripping instead of simply sensational. On one side, you have descriptions and recordings suggesting a chaotic, possibly compromised timeline on the night Monroe died, involving her psychiatrist, her housekeeper, unexplained delays, and conflicting accounts of when an ambulance was actually called. On the other side, you have a seasoned investigative journalist who spent 3 years buried in this material and still landed on the more mundane explanation rather than a dramatic cover-up. The truth seems to live somewhere in that uncomfortable middle ground, which is exactly why this story refuses to fully die. What almost nobody expected was how personal the emotional core of the material would turn out to be. Everyone assumed a project like this would focus on courtroom-style forensic detail, timelines, phone logs, and conflicting witness statements. Instead, the moment that actually broke through and made headlines was hearing Monroe's own recorded reflections on her childhood. She grew up largely without stability, moving between foster homes after her mother was placed in a mental institution. She has described herself in material connected to this research as a wife, someone who never had real roots, who built an entire public identity partly to survive a private life that offered her none of the safety a child needs. Think about the arc of that story. A little girl shuffled between foster homes because her mother could not care for her. A teenager who married young, in part, just to have somewhere stable to live. A young actress who transformed herself so completely that studios eventually forgot there had ever been a person underneath the persona. And then, at the very end, a grown woman sitting in a therapist's office quietly admitting that none of the fame, none of the marriages, none of the magazine covers had actually filled the hole that started when she was a child. That is not the story of a scandal. That is the story of a wound that was never allowed to heal because the world would not let her stop performing long enough to address it. That single detail reframes everything. The world remembers Marilyn Monroe as the ultimate symbol of glamour and desire. The tapes reveal a woman who spent her entire life trying to outrun the same abandonment she experienced as a child, and who never fully escaped it, even at the absolute peak of global fame. So where does this story go from here? And why does it still matter years after that documentary first aired? Because the archive itself is far from fully explored. Summers' original collection contains far more material than any single documentary or book could ever cover. Researchers who have worked with the Margaret Herrick Library's holdings have suggested that additional segments, additional interviews, and additional context remain available for future projects, meaning this is unlikely to be the last time previously unheard material connected to Monroe's life reaches the public. That means there is a real, tangible possibility that more of Marilyn Monroe's actual recorded voice, beyond the fragments already shared publicly, still exists somewhere in that archive, waiting to be catalogued, transcribed, and eventually released. Nobody outside a small circle of archivists and researchers currently knows the full scope of what remains. That uncertainty alone is enough to keep historians, journalists, and documentary producers circling this collection for years to come. There is also the broader question hanging over the entire story. How many other cultural icons have private recordings like this, sitting in vaults, unseen and unheard, waiting for the right archivist, the right journalist, or the right anniversary to bring them into the light? Monroe's case has become something of a case study in how much history can be quietly buried inside private collections, simply because nobody had gotten around to digitizing it yet. It also raises uncomfortable questions about consent and legacy. Marilyn Monroe never agreed to have therapy sessions preserved and eventually broadcast to millions of strangers. She never signed off on her most private confessions becoming the emotional centerpiece of a global documentary. Every decision about releasing this material was made by other people, long after she no longer had any ability to weigh in. Some ethicists and Monroe biographers have raised exactly that concern, arguing that even in service of historical truth, there is something troubling about profiting from a dead woman's therapy sessions, no matter how compelling the material turns out to be. For Hollywood specifically, this story lands as an uncomfortable mirror. An industry that built an entire empire around Marilyn Monroe's image is now being forced to sit with the sound of her actual voice, describing how that same industry treated her as a product rather than a person. That discomfort has shown up in renewed conversations among entertainment historians about how studios in the 1950s and 60s managed, controlled, and in some cases exploited their biggest stars, especially women, and whether the entertainment industry has actually learned anything from it. There is also a political dimension that refuses to fade. Any story that touches the Kennedy family, especially one involving a federal file, communist associations, and a Hollywood star's mysterious death, tends to resurface every time new archival material becomes available. Every few years, new documents get declassified, new researchers get access to old files, and the same questions get asked again with slightly more evidence attached. This is unlikely to be any different. Expect continued interest from journalists, historians, and documentary filmmakers hunting for the next thread to pull. There is also the question of what this means for how future generations study the Kennedy era altogether. Presidential historians have spent decades reconstructing the private lives of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy through memos, second-hand accounts, and carefully guarded archives. A collection like this, built from hundreds of first-hand interviews conducted while many witnesses were still alive, offers a rare independent cross-check against the official record. Every time a portion of it becomes public, it forces historians to revisit assumptions they thought were already settled. What makes this particular moment so powerful, though, is not the politics or even the mystery around her death. It is the simple, devastating fact that after 60 years, people finally got to hear Marilyn Monroe describe her own life in her own words, instead of relying entirely on other people's memories of her. That distinction matters enormously. Biographies are written by other people. Documentaries are edited by other people. But a recording, even a fragmented, decades-old cassette recording, is the closest thing the public will ever get to Marilyn Monroe speaking directly to us. There is a reason breaking news about decades-old audio can feel more urgent than a fresh scandal involving a living celebrity. With the living, there is always a chance for correction, for a follow-up interview, for the person to explain themselves. With Marilyn Monroe, there is no follow-up. Whatever emotion is captured on that tape is permanent, frozen exactly as it was the day she spoke those words, which means every listener is left to sit with her fear and her honesty without any resolution, without any comfort, without any modern update to soften the blow. And that is exactly why the reaction to hearing it was so intense. It is one thing to read a quote attributed to someone in a book written years after they died. It is an entirely different experience to hear the actual tone of their voice shake, to hear the pauses where they searched for the right word, to hear the exhaustion underneath the words themselves. That is not something a script or a headline can fully replicate, and it is exactly why, when those recordings finally reached wider audiences, the response went far beyond typical entertainment news coverage. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge just how rare this kind of material actually is. Most historical figures from the mid-20th century left behind letters, photographs, and official statements curated specifically for public consumption. Very few left behind raw, unscripted audio of themselves in a moment of genuine vulnerability, recorded years before anyone imagined a technology capable of digitizing and distributing it to a global audience instantly. That is part of what makes the Monroe archive so unusual. It was created almost by accident, a byproduct of one journalist's obsessive commitment to getting the story right, decades before anyone understood what that commitment would eventually preserve. If there is one lesson buried inside this entire story, it might be this. The public spent 60 years constructing a version of Marilyn Monroe built almost entirely out of speculation, second-hand stories, and glamorous mythology. The moment her actual voice entered the conversation, all of that speculation had to make room for something far more uncomfortable and far more human. She was not simply a mystery to be solved or a scandal to be uncovered. She was a person who tried, in the most private setting she had access to explain how overwhelmed she felt, only to have even that moment eventually become part of the public record. Whether more of these recordings surface in the years ahead, whether new context emerges about her final hours, or whether researchers eventually gain access to material that has still never been made public, one thing is already certain. The story of Marilyn Monroe is no longer only being told by other people. For the first time in 6 decades, it is also being told by her. This story is far from finished, and every new discovery connected to that archive has the potential to reshape what the world thinks it knows about one of the most famous deaths in Hollywood history. If more of these tapes are released, or if new details emerge from ongoing research into that collection, you will want to know immediately. Somewhere in that archive, there may be more of her voice waiting, more sentences she never expected the world to hear, more moments that could once again make an entire industry stop and listen. Until that day comes, this remains one of the most haunting stories in modern Hollywood history, a reminder that even the most famous woman of the 20th century still had things left to say that nobody heard until it was far too late. Stay subscribed, keep notifications on, and stay right here, because the next chapter of this story could break at any moment.